He said, "I love you, Dad," with the softest smile on his face. That kind of smile you wait years to see again. We had just sat down to eat lunch together. His favorite meal, baked mac and cheese, the creamy kind, with a crispy layer of breadcrumbs on top and just a hint of smoked paprika the way he liked it. Slow-cooked beef, the kind that falls apart with a fork. It had taken me nearly 3 hours to prepare, and it was worth every second just to see him sit across from me at that table. He hadn't been this calm in weeks. Lately, he had been distant, tense, barely speaking, his shoulders always tight, eyes glued to his phone. I thought maybe it was just school stress, maybe a girlfriend issue he didn't want to talk about. So when he sat down and whispered those words, with his head slightly bowed, "I love you, Dad," something in me cracked. I felt like maybe things were turning around. Maybe I was finally getting my son back. I smiled. I served him a second helping before he could even ask. "You don't have to say it," I told him. "I already know, but thank you for saying it." He didn't respond, just nodded, chewed slower than usual. I didn't think much of it. I wanted to believe we were healing. 10 minutes later came the knock. 3 taps, firm, not rushed, not polite. That kind of knock that makes your chest tighten before your brain even processes what's happening. I wiped my hands on the kitchen towel and walked to the door. I didn't rush. I didn't even think. Just opened it. 3 men. Dark uniforms. Serious faces. The middle one looked down at a paper in his hand and said my full name out loud. No greeting. No confusion in his tone. He knew exactly who I was. I turned slightly, confused, and there he was, my son, Mateo, standing behind me, still holding his fork, still looking at his plate. Not a single word, not a glance. The air changed in that moment. Everything slowed down. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the smell of mac and cheese still in the air. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I wasn't just being arrested. I was being erased, not by strangers, but by the person I loved the most in this world. They didn't need to push me. I walked out on my own. My knees were shaking. I looked back one last time, hoping he would at least say something. Maybe apologize, maybe lie, and say it was a mistake. But all he did was sit there, staring at the wall. You don't forget that kind of silence. It burns deeper than any insult. You're not worth fighting for. That your existence is a problem to be solved. And the worst part was the dinner table. The plates were still warm. The food untouched. 2 glasses of orange juice side by side. I had bought the fancy kind he liked. It was a celebration in my heart. I thought we were reconnecting. I thought maybe he was proud of me again. Proud of what I had built with so little. But that smile was just the final stroke in a plan that had started long before that Sunday. They drove me away while my neighbors watched from their windows. One lady I used to fix sinks for had tears in her eyes. She waved slowly as if trying to say sorry without words. I couldn't wave back. My hands were shaking. My stomach was tight. My throat dry. I remember the agent in the front seat asking if I had anything I needed to bring. I said no. What could I take? My memories? My shame? The betrayal? I had nothing left that mattered. In the back seat of that van, I closed my eyes, but not because I was trying to erase the last hour from my head. I wanted to go back to that morning when I was grating cheese by hand for the sauce, singing softly to the old Spanish songs I played when I was homesick. I had been so happy. I thought I was giving my son something to remember me by. A good Sunday, a warm table, a father who loved him unconditionally. But what he gave me in return was silence. And silence cuts deeper than a knife when it comes from your child. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal from someone you raised with your own hands, someone you sacrificed everything for just to be seen as a stranger in your own home, tell me your story. Write in the comments, "I still love them," if you understand this pain. Because sometimes the love doesn't die, even when the bond does. And if stories like this speak to you, if you feel seen in this pain, take a second to subscribe to this channel. Not because we're telling sad stories, but because we're not pretending they don't happen. Every story here is a voice that was silenced too long, and your voice matters too. My name is Luis Fernando Herrera. I am 44 years old, and I live in a small 2-bedroom rental house on the edge of Aurora, Colorado. The kind of neighborhood where you still see kids playing in driveways and older folks watering their front lawns in the afternoon sun. A quiet place, safe, nothing fancy, but enough for me. I pay my rent on time. fix everything myself, and stay out of trouble. That's who I am. That's who I've always been. I'm a handyman, a plumber by trade, but I do a little of everything. Drywall, flooring, painting, you name it. My truck is old, but it runs. My boots are worn, but they've never failed me. I've built this life one job at a time, one honest day after another. No shortcuts, no complaints, just a man trying to live with dignity in a place that was never designed for people like me to thrive. But I made it work. For 18 years, I made it work. I didn't come here chasing some American dream fantasy. I came here because I had no other choice. Back home in El Salvador, there was no future for someone like me. I was 26 when I crossed the border. I didn't speak English. I didn't know anyone. I had $50 in my pocket and a heart full of fear. But I had something stronger than fear. I had a reason. Mateo, my son. He was 2 years old when I left, just a baby. That goodbye still burns in my memory. I kissed him on the forehead while he slept. Promise I couldn't be sure I'd ever fulfill. I told him I'd come back stronger, that I'd build something for him, that everything I was about to endure was for him. The first years here were brutal. I worked 2 jobs, slept on a mattress in someone's garage, ate rice and beans 5 nights a week. I learned to patch walls before I learned to speak English. I learned to sweat in silence and keep my head down, but I never complained, because every week I sent money back home. Not much, just enough. For milk, diapers, rent. Enough so Mateo would never go to bed hungry. Over time, I learned how to navigate this world. I became invisible in all the right ways. I never drove too fast. I never stayed out too late. I memorized the bus schedule. I paid cash for everything. I became a ghost that worked and worked and worked. A ghost with a calloused grip and a tired back. But I was proud, because I knew I was holding my family together from thousands of miles away. I never missed a birthday. Every year, I sent toys, soccer balls, clothes, letters with tiny hand-drawn stars on the envelope. Mateo would send me pictures of his drawings, stick figures of me and him holding hands. My hands were always twice the size of his. That detail made me cry more than once. It told me he still saw me as someone strong, someone to look up to, even from afar. When I finally saved enough to bring him here, it felt like the end of a long storm. I imagined our reunion every night. I pictured him running into my arms, calling me Papa, with joy in his voice. I bought a small bed for him, second-hand but clean. I stocked the fridge with his favorite cereal. I even painted the walls in his room light blue. That's how I remembered his favorite color, light blue. The day he arrived, I wore my best shirt, took the day off. I stood at the airport terminal with flowers, like a nervous teenager waiting for a date. But when he stepped through the gate, he didn't run. He walked slowly, eyes low, awkward. Hugged him tight, but he didn't hug back. I thought maybe he was just overwhelmed, tired, jet-lagged. But in my heart, something whispered the truth. He had grown up without me, and someone else had been filling in the story of who I was all those years. Still, I was determined to make it work. I showed him the house, told him this was his home now. I cooked the meals he liked, took him shopping for school supplies, helped him with homework even when my English failed me. I worked weekends so I could take him to the park on Sundays. I was trying to be the father I never had, but he kept his distance, quiet, polite, but never warm. His eyes never softened when he looked at me. His smile never lingered, and deep down, I started to fear something I didn't want to admit, that the image he had of me in his heart was not the man standing in front of him. Some days, I would catch him staring at his phone with a look I couldn't read. He'd laugh at videos I couldn't understand. I felt like a guest in my own home, a stranger to my own child. And still, I didn't give up. I thought maybe time would fix it. Maybe love would be enough. But love alone is not always enough. Not when poison is being fed slowly, drop by drop. I didn't know the damage had already been done. That somewhere along the way, the version of me in his mind had turned into a villain. Someone absent, someone selfish, someone who left. And I get it. I left. That's a fact I cannot change. But I didn't leave. Wanted to. Because I left so he could eat, so he could live. I left so he would never have to make the choices I did. But none of that mattered anymore. Because once a story takes root in someone's heart, it becomes truth. And in Mateo's heart, I was no longer the man in the drawing with the giant hands. I was the one who disappeared. If this part of the story touches you, if you see yourself or someone you love in these words, I want to hear from you. Write in the comments, I never stopped trying. If you've ever fought to reconnect with someone you love and felt them slipping away, your voice might be the one someone else needs to hear today. And if stories like these help you feel less alone, if they make you stop and breathe and say, that's exactly how I feel, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Here, we don't just tell stories, we bring voices back to life. Voices like yours. The desert at night is not quiet. That was the first thing I learned as I crossed into the unknown. There's two here. Wind howls like a warning. The ground feels alive, like it remembers every footstep that came before yours. My shoes were soaked in sweat by the end of the first day. My lips cracked open by the second. By the third, we didn't speak at all. Our voices had become useless. All we had left was the sound of our breathing and the crunch of dry earth under our feet. I left El Salvador with nothing but a picture of my son folded into my wallet and a prayer I must have whispered 1,000 times. Mateo's face in that photo was soft, round cheeks, a gap in his front teeth, the kind of smile only a child who doesn't know hardship can wear. I kept touching that picture every time I thought I couldn't take another step. I'd pull it out under the moonlight and whisper, soon, like a promise he could hear from across the world. The men I crossed with were from all over, Honduras, Guatemala, some barely adults, some already grandfathers, but we all had the same eyes that had seen too much to be called innocent, but still carried something called hope, that stubborn flame that refuses to go out even when the wind is against you. We paid a coyote who promised safety. He wore sunglasses at night and smelled like expensive cologne. He talked about the journey like it was just another road trip, said we'd be across in 2 days max. That lie didn't even last until sunrise. By the time we made it past the river, we were already dehydrated. We lost 2 along the way. One turned back. The other collapsed and never got up. We had to keep walking. That's what they don't tell you, that sometimes the only way to survive is to keep walking and never look back. I was 26 years old and had never felt smaller than I did crossing that land. I remember thinking, this must be what ants feel like, crawling across something massive, exposed, vulnerable, and still moving. When we finally reached the outskirts of McAllen, Texas, I thought we were safe, but the journey was just beginning. I hid in the back of a pickup truck covered by a tarp for 8 hours straight. No bathroom, no food, just the smell of gasoline and the sound of my own heartbeat. When I finally stepped onto American soil, for real, with my own 2 feet and no more running, I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood still for a long time. The air was different. It smelled like dust and asphalt, but to me, it smelled like a beginning. I arrived in Los Angeles 3 days later with blisters on both feet and a stomach that hadn't had a full meal in a week. A cousin let me sleep on his floor. He gave me a job washing dishes at the diner where he worked, 12-hour shifts, no questions asked. That was the rule. You work hard, you keep your head down, and maybe, just maybe, you survive long enough to build something. I learned how to live with less. I reused everything. I wore the same shirt 5 days in a row. I used my lunch break to read English out loud from old newspapers. At night, I'd call home with a prepaid phone card and listen to Mateo tell me what he ate that day. Sometimes he wouldn't talk at all, just silence. But I stayed on the line, just to hear him breathe. I started sending money home by the 3rd month. The first transfer was $50. It felt like a fortune. I remember holding the bills in my hands, counting them 3 times, and kissing them before sealing the envelope. I didn't eat that day, but my son did. That became my routine. Work, send money, sleep 4 hours, again, work. Every month I sent more, 70, then 100, then 200. I learned how to stretch $10 over 5 days. I became an expert at survival, not just for me, for him. Over the years, I changed cities looking for better work, Denver, Phoenix, Albuquerque. But no matter where I went, Mateo's photo came with me. It lived in my wallet like a heartbeat, faded, folded, but never forgotten. I got better jobs, painting houses, fixing water heaters. I learned how to install cabinets, tile bathrooms, fix drywall. I learned the language of tools and measurements. Not the kind they teach in school, the kind that builds trust. Clients started requesting me by name. I was the quiet one who did the job right the first time. And even though I didn't have papers, I had reputation. In our world, that's the real passport. I watched entire families grow while I stayed alone. Birthdays I missed, funerals I couldn't attend, weddings I watched through cracked phone screens. But I told myself it was worth it. Every sacrifice had a purpose. That someday Matteo would understand. That someday he would know I never stopped being his father, even from far away. The hardest nights were the ones when I felt like a ghost, walking into houses I'd never live in, fixing homes I'd never own, watching fathers play with their children while I stood in the background holding a wrench. And still, I kept going. Because my story wasn't about comfort. It was about responsibility, about giving a better life to the boy I left behind, about keeping a promise that most people forget the moment they cross the border. I never forgot, not once. Every screw I turned, every paycheck I earned, every night I fell asleep on a mattress I bought secondhand. It was all for him. If you've ever crossed a line for someone you love, if you've risked everything for a chance to give them more than you ever had, I want to hear from you. Write in the comments, I did it for them. If your journey has been fueled by sacrifice, your words could be a lifeline for someone else walking that same desert now. And if these stories help you breathe a little deeper, if they make you feel like your pain has a place in the world, I invite you to follow this channel. Not for the drama, but for the truth. Because we tell the stories that don't make it to the news. Stories of real people, like you, like me. The day Matteo arrived in the United States was the kind of day I had imagined 1,000 times. It was bright, cloudless, the kind of morning where even the air smells like fresh beginnings. I stood at the airport in Denver, shirt tucked in, shoes polished, hands trembling. I had cleaned the entire house the night before. I even lit a vanilla candle in his room because I read somewhere that scent helps create lasting memories. I wanted his first memory in our home to be soft, safe, warm. When I saw him walk through those glass doors, everything else blurred. He was taller than I remembered, thinner. His eyes had changed. Not the color, the depth. There was distance in them, as if he had already made peace with staying guarded. I opened my arms, and he let me hug him. His arms stayed stiff at his sides for a moment before he gave me a pat on the back. I told myself it was nerves, jet lag, too many hours on a plane. But something in that embrace whispered otherwise. We drove home in silence. I pointed out the schools, the parks, the diner I sometimes worked in on weekends. He nodded, eyes staring through the window as if searching for something I couldn't name. I asked if he wanted to stop for food. He said he wasn't hungry. His voice was lower than I remembered. He sounded older, like someone who had already decided not to be impressed. Back at the house, I showed him his room. I had painted it blue, the soft kind, like the sky right before the sun rises. His bed was made. I had found a desk for him where he could do his homework, read, draw, whatever he liked. I told him this was his space. He looked around and said, thanks. No smile, no questions, just that. That night, I made pupusas the way my mother used to. I hoped it would remind him of home, of childhood, of me. He picked at the food, then said he was tired. I watched him disappear into his room. The door closed without a sound. I lay awake for hours that night, listening, waiting to hear him move around, maybe get water, maybe peek into my room. Nothing, just silence, the kind that slowly builds a wall. The first weeks were hard. He started school right away. I packed his lunches every morning, always adding something sweet with a note. Things like, good luck today, or you got this, or just a simple, I'm proud of you. He never mentioned them, not once. Some days he would come home and go straight to his room. Other days, he'd sit on the couch with his phone glued to his hand. I asked him about school. He said it was fine. I asked about friends. He said he had some. His answers were always short, always safe. He kept his real thoughts locked away like I was a stranger renting space in the same house. I tried bonding through little things. A movie night, a trip to the hardware store, a Sunday walk through the park. I even bought a used bike for him so we could ride together. He said thanks, but never touched it. I remember one Saturday I asked if he wanted to help me fix a leaking faucet. Just a small repair, something we could do together. He said no without looking up from his phone. It felt like a door closing, quiet but final. I told myself it just needed time, that kids need space to adjust, that maybe he was grieving the home he left behind. But the truth was harder to swallow. Mateo didn't know me, and worse, he had been raised with an idea of me that I couldn't compete with. In one of our rare conversations, he asked me why I left him. The words came out flat, not angry, not sad, just cold, like he was reading from a script. I told him the truth. Left that so he could eat, so he could be safe, so he could have shoes that fit, and a roof that didn't leak. I told him I made the kind of choice no one should ever have to make, that every night I called home and every dollar I sent was my way of being there, even if I couldn't hold him. He didn't respond, just turned back to his screen. That was the moment I knew. Someone had already told him their version of who I was, and that version had roots deeper than anything I could pull out. I started finding little signs, messages from someone saved in his phone as M, long conversations in Spanish, photos from back home. I recognized the house in the background, his mother's place. I saw him smile at those messages in a way he never smiled at me. I knew she was still in his ear, still feeding him doubt, still making sure I never became the hero in his story. She had the power of years, of proximity, of presence. And all I had was sacrifice, sent through wires. There was one night I remember clearly. I woke up at 2 a.m. and found the light still on in the hallway. Mateo was sitting at the kitchen table with his phone in one hand and a picture in the other. The photo was of him and his mom. He didn't see me standing there. I watched him stare at it for minutes. Then he whispered something. I couldn't hear what he said. But whatever it was, it wasn't for me. I didn't go back to bed. I sat in the living room, staring at nothing, wondering when, exactly, I had lost my place in my son's heart. Or, if I ever had it at all. If you've ever tried to build a bridge across years of absence, if you've ever stood in front of someone you love and realized they only see your shadow, please share your story. Write in the comments, I was never gone, if you've loved someone from a distance and they never saw it. Your words might help someone else feel seen for the first time. And if these stories remind you of your own life, if they echo a pain you've carried, quietly take a second to subscribe to this channel. Not for sympathy, but for connection. Because sometimes what heals us most is hearing that we were never alone in what we felt. The way a mother speaks about a father in front of a child matters more than most people understand. Words leave stains that cannot be washed away with time. They sink into the cracks of a child's heart and grow into something sharp. I started to realize that long before Mateo ever said it out loud. He didn't have to. His silence said everything. I could see it in his eyes whenever I mentioned his mother. There was something guarded there, a flicker of loyalty that didn't belong to me. I never spoke badly about her, not once, even though I had every reason to. Even though I knew what she was doing, I kept telling myself that if I just showed him kindness, patience, love, he would see the truth. But I underestimated how powerful her version of the story had become. Back in El Salvador, when I left, she was hurt. We weren't together as a couple anymore, but we shared Mateo's care. She didn't want me to leave. She said he needed a father. I said he needed food. She said I was abandoning him. I said I was saving him. She said I was choosing money over family. I said I was choosing survival. We were both right, and we were both broken by it. But over the years, that wound didn't close. It festered, and I think, in her pain, she needed a villain. Someone to blame when Mateo asked hard questions. Why
Dad
is not here? Why doesn't he come to my school? Why do other kids have their fathers, and I don't? Instead of saying he's working for you, he's sending you everything he can. She said he left. He chose another life. She probably said it in passing. Maybe after a long day. Maybe when the bills piled up and she was tired of holding everything alone. But children remember what we say when we are hurting, and they believe us, especially when it's about someone who isn't there to defend themselves. I started noticing how Mateo would get quiet every time I shared a memory from the past. I would say, when you were little, I used to call every Sunday. and he would just look down. I would show him photos I printed of things I built, places I worked, old pictures of him on my wall in every room. He never asked questions, never showed interest. It was like he had already filed those parts of my life away under fiction. He once said something I'll never forget. We were watching a movie, something about a father and son who reunite after years apart. At the end, the son forgives the father and says, "You were always my hero." I looked over, hoping for some kind of connection, and Matteo just muttered, "Not everyone gets a hero." It was soft, but it hit like a truck. That night, I sat in my room and tried to piece it together. I remembered the years I spent in construction sites, lifting bricks until my back screamed. I remembered the days I worked through fevers because rent was due, and Matteo needed medicine. I remembered how I would send gifts, notes, drawings, and get nothing in return but silence or thank you through his mother. And now it made sense. He was never allowed to see those things as love. They were just packages from a man who disappeared. I never thought I would feel jealous of my own absence, but I was. Because she had all the days I lost, the mornings he woke up sick, the nights he couldn't sleep, the first time he rode a bike, the time he fell and needed stitches. Those are the moments that build trust between a parent and child. I had none of them, and all she had to do was rewrite the past one conversation at a time. It became clearer when I found the letter. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a charger in Matteo's room. I opened a drawer and saw a folded piece of paper with my name on it. It was from his mother. She had written it before he came here. She told him to stay strong and remember who always loved you, and not to let him buy your heart. That sentence broke something in me. Not to let him buy your heart. That's how she framed me. As someone trying to win love through things, as if the meals I cooked were transactions, as if the roof over his head was a bribe, as if I had not bled for this child for almost 2 decades. And yet, I didn't confront him. I folded the letter back, put it exactly where I found it, because I knew that if I confronted him, he would shut down even more. I knew that trust doesn't repair through force. It has to grow back through silence and soil. I started noticing the way he flinched when I raised my voice on the phone, not yelling at him, just talking to a client, but something in his body would tense, like he expected to be hurt, like maybe he had heard stories of me that were not true. I asked him once, gently, "Did your mom ever say anything about me?" He didn't look up from his cereal. He just said, "She said you did what you had to do." The way he said it didn't feel like understanding. It felt like a sentence. I didn't press him. I just nodded. But inside, I was drowning in things I wanted to say. I wanted to tell him how I cried myself to sleep the first night I left, how I once walked 3 miles to work in the rain because I didn't have bus fare after sending him money, how I worked with a broken finger because I couldn't afford a day off. But I knew those things wouldn't matter if he already believed I left for myself. People talk a lot about abandonment, but they don't talk enough about the pain of being misremembered, of watching your child love an idea of you that was never yours to shape, of knowing that someone else filled in your silence with their words. If you've ever been blamed for your absence while carrying the weight of your love in silence, share your story. Comment below with, "I never stopped loving them," if you've been painted as a stranger in the eyes of someone you would give your life for. And if you're still listening to this, and something inside you feels seen, maybe for the first time, I invite you to follow this channel. Not because we have all the answers, but because we ask the questions that matter. And sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones we need to speak out loud, together. There is a kind of silence that feels heavier than sound, a stillness in the house that makes the air feel thick. That was the silence Matteo carried with him everywhere. He was there, but not really. He moved like someone walking through fog, always distracted, always elsewhere. I tried not to take it personally at first. Teenagers are quiet, I told myself. They guard their worlds like castles. But this was different. His distance wasn't just emotional, it was deliberate, calculated. He started locking his door, not just when changing, but even during the day. I would knock and hear the rustling of papers, the sudden click of a screen going dark. He'd open the door just enough to talk through the gap. He said he was doing homework, but I knew the difference between study and secrecy. And whatever was happening behind that door, I wasn't part of it. One night, I was taking out the trash when I passed by his window. His curtains were drawn, but the light was on. His voice floated out, low and rushed, speaking Spanish. Not to me. I leaned in and caught a few words. Things like, "They said it would help," and "I don't want to lie anymore." I didn't understand who he was talking to, but I knew it wasn't a classmate. His tone was too serious, too rehearsed, like someone following instructions. He was spending more and more time online, always on his phone or laptop. He had created accounts I didn't recognize. One night, I saw a notification pop up on his phone when it was charging in the living room. A username, not his. Something like Freedom Future 94. The message said, "Thank you for your courage. You're doing the right thing." I didn't touch the phone, but those words carved a pit into my stomach. I began noticing printed papers in the trash, pages with government seals, maps, checklists. I once found a crumpled flyer with the words, "Report Undocumented Crimes Against America." I stared at that paper for 10 minutes before throwing it away. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want to believe it. There's a movement in this country that few talk about. Groups online that target children of immigrants. They disguise themselves as support networks or advocacy for truth. But what they really are is recruitment. They find kids who feel angry, confused, torn between two worlds, and they feed them stories. They say things like, "You have a right to speak out," and "Your father broke the law, not you." They weaponize pain. They teach betrayal as bravery. Mateo was always a thoughtful boy, curious, observant, but he had no tools to process the storm inside him. All he had was a history fed to him by someone who resented me, and now a group that saw his pain as a chance to make a statement. He didn't hate me. That was the hardest part. He was trying to make sense of two truths: the father who sacrificed everything, and the version of me that had been painted as selfish and illegal. I watched him wrestle with it. I could see it in the way he avoided my eyes during dinner, the way he would start to say something and then swallow it. One night, he asked me, out of nowhere, "Do you ever feel guilty for being here?" I didn't answer right away. I asked him what he meant. He said, "You broke the law. Doesn't that ever bother you?" His voice didn't have anger, just something colder, detached, like he was reading from someone else's script. I told him the truth. I told him that guilt lives with me every day, that I feel guilty when I see other fathers walk their kids to school, that I feel guilty when I watch American news and wonder if people like me are only seen as problems to be solved. But I also told him that survival isn't always legal, that loving your child sometimes means crossing lines others can't understand, that I chose between hunger and hope, and I chose hope. He didn't say anything after that, just went back to his room. I stood there at the dinner table, his half-eaten plate still warm, wondering if he heard me, wondering if any of it mattered. I started to worry he was being watched too, that someone was guiding him directly. I noticed strange emails. An envelope came once addressed to him from a place in Washington. When I asked, he said it was for a school project, but I opened the mail later and found a booklet. Citizens First, Protecting America from Within. It was propaganda, glossy, manipulative, pages filled with phrases like, "Even family should obey the law," and "Your silence makes you part of the problem." I thought about confronting him, about taking his phone, deleting his accounts, but I knew that would only push him deeper into secrecy, and I didn't want him to see me as the enemy. I still believed I could reach him, that if I just kept loving him, kept showing up, he would see the truth. But love is not always loud enough to drown out a campaign. There's a real system in place here, one that rewards silence in some places and rebellion in others. I found out that some kids are offered incentives to cooperate, not money, not directly, but promises, that they'll be seen as brave, that they'll be helped, that they'll be safer if they separate from the criminals in their homes. These programs exist in the shadows, and they work. They make children feel like adults, like they're doing something noble, even if it means giving up the person who held their hand when they were scared of the dark. And Mateo, my son, was already halfway down that road, not because he was evil, not because he hated me, but because he was lost. and someone found him before I could. If you've ever felt the ground shift under your own home, if you've watched someone you love change because of things they were, hold in secret, I want to hear from you. Comment below with, "They got to them first." If you've seen influence divide your family, your voice can be a mirror for someone still searching for their reflection. And if these words echo something deep in your heart, something you've never had the space to say aloud, I hope you'll stay with us. Subscribe, not for sympathy, but for strength. Because in every truth we tell here, there's someone who finally feels seen. And maybe that someone is you. I remember the exact moment everything snapped into place. Not because something dramatic happened, but because it didn't. It was a Sunday, one of those slow, quiet afternoons where you can hear the neighbor's sprinkler clicking in the distance. I was in the kitchen, seasoning the beef, letting it simmer the way Mateo liked. Garlic, cumin, a pinch of chili powder, not too spicy. I even opened a can of corn and buttered the tortillas myself. The kind of meal that says, I see you, I love you, even if I don't know how to say it out loud. He came into the kitchen with his phone in hand, scrolling as usual. He barely looked up. I said, "Lunch is ready." He nodded, sat down, and kept his eyes glued to the screen. But I saw it. The tension in his shoulders. The way his fingers gripped the phone tighter than normal. He was waiting for something, or dreading something. We ate in silence. I tried to fill the air with small talk. Told him about a funny client I had who called me 3 times to fix a leaky pipe that turned out to be just condensation. Mateo gave a small laugh, almost polite. Then he said, "Thanks for lunch, Dad. This is really good." I smiled. That sentence felt like a window opening. I thought we were turning a corner. I thought that maybe, just maybe, something had shifted. That moment was the reason I made dessert. Arroz con leche, his favorite. I sprinkled cinnamon on top like my mother used to. I handed him the bowl. He took one bite and said, "Just like I remember." The first time he talked about the past without bitterness. He even leaned back and said, "You're really trying, huh?" I looked at him and said, "I've been trying since the day you were born." And he nodded, looked down, whispered, "I know." For a second, the world paused. For a second, I believed everything I sacrificed was finally making sense to him. That second did not last long. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Not frantic, not casual, just sharp, purposeful. I walked to the ivory door with the towel still over my shoulder, opened it, and saw 2 officers, ICE. One of them looked straight at me and said my full name. Not a question, a confirmation. Behind me, I felt the air shift. Mateo stood frozen, fork still in his hand, the smell of cinnamon still in the room. The officer asked to speak to me outside. I stepped out. My heart was racing, but I didn't want to show fear. I had nothing on me. No wallet, no phone, just a stained apron and shaking hands. They asked aware of my status if I knew I was being reported. I said I didn't understand. They said they received a tip, an anonymous submission with details only someone inside the house would know. My full name, my employer, the license plate of my truck, my work schedule, the days I was home, the days I wasn't. The officer asked if I wanted to say anything before they proceeded. I turned to look back at the house, hoping it was all a mistake, hoping this was a cruel misunderstanding. Mateo was standing by the window. His eyes met mine, and then he looked away, down, silent. That silence was my answer. They didn't handcuff me, maybe because I didn't resist, maybe because I looked too broken to run. I stepped into their car with my heart in pieces and my soul trying to keep breathing. As they drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching my house get smaller, watching the place I had built with every fiber of my being disappear. I didn't ask why he did it. I already knew. Out of hate. It wasn't. It wasn't even out of revenge. It was confusion, manipulation, pressure. Maybe someone promised him a better life, a cleaner slate. Maybe he thought this was the only way to be free of the tension, of the questions, of the burden of choosing sides. Or maybe he thought he was saving me from a life of hiding. I will never know, because he never spoke to me after that day. I was held for 36 hours. They processed me like paperwork, fingerprints, questions, an interpreter I didn't need. A list of things I couldn't understand. I gave them my name 100 times. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just kept thinking about how the arroz con leche was still sitting on the table, how the food I made with love would now go cold in a house that no longer held a father. They released me with a notice to appear, a date, a file, a countdown. I returned to my home like a ghost. Mateo wasn't there. He had gone to stay with a friend, or maybe a contact, someone from the group that, I don't know. The house was clean, the dishes were gone, but his room was empty. Not in the way that says, I'll be back. Empty, like finality. Like he had packed his loyalty and walked out for good. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at nothing. My hands still smelled like cumin and garlic. The towel I had over my shoulder was still damp, and in that silence, the betrayal wasn't the loudest thing. It was the loss of hope, the realization that love is not always enough to heal someone who's already been handed a different version of you. I know now that the most dangerous thing in a broken world is not anger. It's the slow, quiet turning of a child's heart by voices louder than yours, by people who speak with authority and offer safety dressed as freedom, who turn healing into evidence and sacrifice into guilt. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, not out of hate, but because someone else got to their heart first, I want to hear your story. Comment below with, I was erased without a word, if you've ever felt replaced in silence. Your truth deserves to be heard. And if this story echoes somewhere deep inside you, if it reminds you that pain has a language only those who've lived it can truly understand, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here, we are not telling stories for views. We are reclaiming voices that were never meant to disappear. Voices like mine. Voices like yours. I still remember how ordinary Saturday morning felt. The sun had already climbed halfway up the sky when I decided to surprise Mateo with breakfast out. I chose a small diner, one I had worked in during my early days here, because I wanted him to see something real. I wanted him to smell the coffee, hear the clink of plates, feel a moment of normalcy. I walked in with hope. He followed quietly behind. He didn't say much. He never did. But I told myself he was observing. He ordered pancakes. Not the fancy kind, just simple, but stacked high. Syrup running like amber. I watched him pick at the edges. He smiled once. Just once. It was the kind of smile that starts at the eyes, fleeting and soft. I felt my chest tighten, and I thought maybe we were inching closer. I asked how school was. He said, fine. I asked about his friends. He said, they're okay. Nothing more. Everything felt like walking on glass. Later, while he was in the restroom, I got a call. A number I did not recognize. I answered. A voice said, we have your schedule. We know when you're home. I hung up. Cold sweat poured down my back. The diner echoed with the sounds of coffee machines and friendly chatter. I sat there, pretending to eat my breakfast, while my brain raced. The same voice repeated in my mind. We have your schedule. The pancakes tasted like ash. When Mateo came back, he asked if I was all right. I lied. I said yes. I said I was just a little tired. He nodded and went back to staring at his phone. I didn't push. I didn't ask if he had heard something. I just sat across from him and tried to be the father I remembered being abroad, in dreams. I told him about the job I had at the diner years ago when I washed dishes. Told him how I saved every tip, bought a used toolbox, and finally got my own truck. I thought he'd lean in, ask a question. He didn't, but he didn't walk away either. When we left the diner, I saw the same two officers waiting outside. They weren't in uniforms. They didn't approach us. They stood a few feet away, chatting quietly, looking at my truck. My heart lurched. I walked briskly to my car, held the door for Mateo, and drove home. I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The officers stayed. They didn't follow. Not yet. At home, the truck sat idle. Mateo went to his room. I followed him 10 minutes later to check on something and found his door closed from the inside. I knocked. No answer. Eventually, I opened it quietly and saw his laptop open, metal stickers peeling from the lid. He jumped, looked at me with surprise and anger all mixed, then closed it abruptly. I asked what he was doing. He said nothing. I asked if he needed anything. He said he had things to handle and to not bother him. I backed out. He slammed the door. I stood there with my hand on the wood, listening to his breathing. The sound made me wonder how many times I had missed this, his heartbeat in the house, and taken for granted that it would always be the sound of connection. Instead, it had become a wall. Later I found what looked like a schedule taped behind his closet. A calendar. days crossed out, times circled, my name and the license plate number of my truck scribbled in a corner. I rushed to sit down. My mind raced. I thought about all the nights I showered in the backyard so the landlord wouldn't smell the paint, about all the times I skipped lunch so I could send money to El Salvador so that Mateo would have school supplies. And suddenly, I saw every sacrifice under a new light. Not pride, fear. That night, I knocked on his door and asked if he would sit with me for 5 minutes on the couch. He hesitated, then came out. He sat 2 feet away. I poured tea for both of us. I told him I knew life felt unfair. I told him that I came here so that he would not have to choose between food and school. He looked at me and said, "I know." He did not say, "Thank you." He said, "I know," but it was enough for a moment, enough to show that the wall had cracks. If you've ever felt your world shift under your feet, yet walked forward anyway, I want to hear your story. Comment below with, "I held on." If you've carried a fear that no one sees and still showed up, your voice matters. And if you're here because you believe in the power of survival in silence, then click subscribe. We're building a space for the unsung moments, the moments that change lives quietly but deeply. It was mid-afternoon when I knew that everything had collapsed into a new truth I wasn't ready to face. I had been in the kitchen, washing the dishes from lunch, thinking about how the appetite he once had vanished, how the laughter we used to share had disappeared into corners where I couldn't reach. And then the knock came. 3 sharp rap, rap, rap on the door. I froze with the sponge in my hand. My chest tightened. Time slowed. I heard the tap of water still running in the sink behind me. His favorite plate, half eaten, sat on the counter. When I opened the door, the 2 agents were there, in plain clothes with badges that glinted and faces that didn't blink. My name full and true on their lips. I looked behind them, hoping to see Mateo standing there, maybe apologizing, maybe explaining, but he wasn't. He was inside, still by his plate, still avoiding my eyes. They asked me to step outside. The air was colder out there, sharper, as if it carried judgment. I stood at the threshold of my home, the way you stand on the edge of something you cannot step back from. They told me I was being reported. Someone had given my address. Someone had given my schedule. Someone had used the details of my life like a weapon. The words landed like heavy stones. I looked at my truck parked in the driveway. The one I bought, used, saved for, stained with years of sweat and labor. I remembered the first day I drove it, the pride I felt, the freedom I believed it symbolized, and now it was part of the evidence against me. I asked them if I could go inside for something forgotten. They let me. I grabbed that half-eaten plate. I picked it up and went outside to sit on the curb. The aroma of garlic and cumin still clung to it. I inhaled. I wished I could breathe the comfort back into it. I wished I could fold this moment into something redeeming. The agent asked if I had anything to say. I did not ask why. I already knew who stood between us. I didn't cry. I didn't resist. I just watched the agents reflect my face in the tinted glass of their vehicle. I saw a man who basted beef for his son. I saw a man who crossed deserts for a promise. And I saw someone who had been erased in the eyes that mattered most. I dared not look for Mateo in that moment. I knew he was still inside, maybe watching, maybe not. But his absence was louder than any word. At the processing center, I sat on a bench, zip-tie bracelets on my wrists, as an officer read out my rights with an interpreter nearby. The room smelled of bleach and fear. I tried to remember the jokes I told him when he was 6, the way his knees pounded with hope the first time he scored a goal. I asked myself how far from those moments I had traveled. I watched the other men. Some still had their families with them. Some cried when they connected with someone through video calls. I felt the shame of being exposed by the one I trusted most. It wasn't just the handcuffs that hurt. It was the betrayal, the quiet step away, the hinge of a door closing without a voice. When they released me, it was with a date, a file, number, a future I was told to show up for. They didn't say when I would be allowed to return home. The drive back felt like a ghost ride. My truck felt too big, the roads too long. The radio played songs about sunshine and freedom. My ears heard threat and silence. I pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same. The clock still ticked, but I felt like the walls were moving away from me. Mateo was gone. In his room, the bed was made but empty. The bike we bought sat in the garage, dusty. The cereal boxes I bought on sale yesterday were still half full in the cabinet. He might have left of his own choice or been guided to leave. Either way, it didn't matter. The echo of his shoes in the hallway stopped. That hush became part of my new silence. I sat for hours at the kitchen table, the same table we shared meals on, the same table where I once heard, "I love you, Dad." I held a photo in my hand. A small picture of him on a beach from years ago. He had sand on his feet. He laughed with abandon. I asked myself who I was in that photo, and who I had become. I thought about every dollar I saved for him, every hour I skipped rest for him, every night I called home so he wouldn't forget the sound of me. I wondered if any of that mattered now. If you have ever been left behind by someone you cared for deeply, if you have watched your own world unravel, not because of illness or war, but because someone you trusted stepped away, I want to hear your story. Comment with, "I waited anyway." If you stayed when you had reason to leave, your words might reach a person still sitting in the dark alone. And if this story resonates with something buried inside you, click subscribe, because we are not just listeners of pain. We are rememberers of strength. We are the quiet ones who still stand when the world expected us to fall. I stood behind bars made of silence, not steel, once I arrived at the detention center. The room smelled of bleach. Voices faded into echoes, and the ee click of the lock felt like a verdict. They took my picture, my fingerprints, asked the same questions I'd answered 1,000 times. Name, date of birth, country of origin. Each word a hammer hitting the last nail of what I called home. My mind wandered back to my toolbox, the dents and scratches bearing witness to every job, every hour I worked so that my son could have something. All that effort now weighed like lead in my pockets. The officer told me, "You will be notified of a hearing." He didn't say when. A date that felt neither near nor far, a shadow hovering. My file number was handed over like a label, a stub of the life I once controlled. I looked down at my truck's blue-green paint, the faded logo on its door still visible. It was parked in the driveway, keys in the ignition, waiting for me, now waiting for what would come next. Inside the holding room I watched others, men like me, wives weeping, children huddled, students hoping someone would show up at the curb. The man beside me whispered he had sent money home too, every week for years. He said his daughter didn't know the house they had left behind was now a memory. I listened. The anxiety in his voice matched the tremor in my hands. The legal forms, the phone calls, the what-ifs multiplied like cracks in a windshield. When I got released, no fanfare, just a rubber stamp and a warning. I drove home through the city lights and empty roads. I wondered how the house looked now. My son's room still painted light blue. His bed made, the bike I bought leaning against the wall. The invoices I had stacked on the shelf, I feared they were now proof of a life someone else considered illegal. The hours I skipped, the nights I spent talking into my crackling phone line, I questioned whether they mattered. My son was gone. The door to his room shut tight. I entered quietly and felt the absence like cold air rushing through an open window. I touched the desk we bought together. The scribbles on the edge still visible. Math homework, Dad's help, he had written in biro. I wondered if he ever erased it. I tried to piece together the memories. His first goal scored, his laughter after he finally learned to ride the bike. But those stories felt like old films I watched from behind glass. Beautiful, but out of reach. And I realized the effects weren't just in the missing phone calls or empty chairs. They were deeper. Research shows children whose parents face detention or deportation show increased rates of anxiety, depression, even physical illnesses later in life. Children who live with fear in their home stop sleeping, stop smiling, and their growing minds get twisted by trauma too big to name. I thought of every time I looked at my son and saw reluctance where love should have been. I thought about the plate of arroz con leche still standing on the table, cold and forgotten. I thought about the reporter in the lounge of the diner who once told me, "Your story isn't uncommon." I protested, "But it's my son's story too." He gave me a look like I had answered correctly. Lives marked by waiting rooms and courtrooms, paperwork and unspoken farewells. I closed my eyes and heard the knock again. the same as before. But this time, I opened the door, prepared to face something different. Not hope, acceptance. I walked with them without resistance, because the fight had been inside me long before. My mind revisited that Sunday, the laughter I thought I heard, the "I love you, Dad" I still smelled in the air like burnt garlic and sweet cream. If you've ever walked back into a house after being told you must leave if you don't have your papers, if you've waited for a number or a date while your life stood still, I want to hear your voice. Comment below with "Still here despite it all." If you've faced a door you couldn't open, your story might give someone else the strength to knock again. And if these words reach a place of truth in you, if you feel seen rather than searching for sight, I invite you to subscribe, not for stories about victims, but for voices of survival. Because surviving isn't enough if our stories disappear into the silence. I could feel the tremor under my feet as I walked that silent corridor toward the courtroom. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like the hum in my chest, steady, unsettling. My name etched on every paper. The hours I spent constructing a life, every sunrise I chased for my son's sake, now narrowed down to a numbered file in someone else's hand. I sat with my lawyer, the long gray wall behind us, and the distant clack of typewriters echoing in the back. I had become a case, a precedent. But behind every form I signed, every box I checked, was the image of my son. His eyes, once full of hope, now clouded by something I could not reach. The room was crowded. A woman next to me cried softly. A father across the aisle stared out the window, his phone pressed to his ear. I stared at the judge, a stern figure with years of deliberation in his gaze. He thanked us for our patience and asked if we were ready to proceed. My lawyer whispered that it would take 10 minutes. 10 minutes that would decide whether I could stay longer or be sent away. In those 10 minutes, I watched the clock move and thought of every second I had missed with my child. Birthdays, first shoes, scraped knees. I thought of the plate of arroz con leche left on the table. I thought of the silence that grew between us and mutated into a stranger. And I wondered if those 10 minutes now contained the weight of an entire life. Behind me, I heard a file clerk call my name. I rose. My shoes made a soft sound on the tile. The judge asked me to stand. He asked in English whether I understood the charges, the possible consequences. My lawyer translated. I said yes, I did. I understood. I understood that the life I had built could be crumbled by a slip of paper, by a decision I had no control over. I looked at the microphone in front of me, the i.e. hard surface of the desk, the gavel waiting in its slot. Everything felt distant. Everything felt irrevocable. I told the judge what I had already told my son, that I came here so he could eat, so he could be safe, that every drop of sweat on my brow, every night I curled under a blanket in someone else's garage, was for him. I looked up and said, I was not a criminal. I worked. I fixed pipes. I taught my son how to dream. I asked for mercy. It was the first time I asked for mercy, not just for myself, but for him, for the boy who still waited, who still believed in me enough to say those words. But behind his eyes I had seen something dying, a belief fading into something else. The judge paused. I thought the silence would break me. It didn't. It expanded. He stared at the files, then back at me. Then he asked who would take care of my son if I were removed. My voice caught. I said that I didn't know. I said that I had no answer. Because I didn't. The person I had built everything for had already built another version of me in his mind. One I could no longer reach. I felt warmth slide out of my body. I felt the court freeze time. When the judge ruled that I must appear again in 2 months, I exhaled. But it was not relief. It was delay. They handed me a date and told me to leave. I walked down the steps, feeling older. The wood creaked. My heart resonated with that sound. I walked to my truck and thought of the toolbox in the back, the scratch-marked handle, the certificate of my identity as a worker, a father. I drove home through twilight and wondered if goodbye was creeping into our lives unnoticed. Inside the house, the light was dim, the curtains drawn, his toys still in the corner, his bed still made. The scent of his jersey after practice lingered in the air. I wanted to scream that I was still here, that I had not given up. But the echo answered back, we know you are, but we don't see you. I found the letter again, the one folded under his. I opened it and read the lines his mother wrote. "Do not let him buy your heart." I closed it and held it against my chest. That sentence carved a scar inside me, the one you clean slowly, but never forget. If you have ever felt the weight of someone else's truth become the lie of your life, if you have watched a child you raised turn into someone you barely recognize, please share your voice. Comment below with "My truth still stands," and let your story breathe in this space. And if you're here because survival is not just about staying alive, but about keeping your voice alive too, I invite you to subscribe. We build not just narratives, but lifelines, because even when the judge's gavel falls, we still speak. Thank you for staying with me to the very end. The journey I've shared today wasn't just about leaving a country. It was about the quiet moments, the sacrifices, the unanswered questions, and the hope that still flickers in the darkness. I've told you who I was, what I did, and how I held on when everything seemed to fall away. And though the road is far from over, I'm here, still standing. To my son, I've wanted you to remember the smell of garlic in the kitchen, to remember the softness of that first hug when you walked through the airport doors, to remember that every day of my life was spent trying to build something for you, even when the world told me I didn't belong. I know the silence has been loud. I know the space between us feels unbridgeable, but I also believe in what's still invisible. The hours of toil, the midnight calls home, the torn shoes and empty belly, so you might have your books and your future. If you've ever carried a load alone, if you've ever been the one who sent money while feeling invisible, I see you. If you've ever loved someone who couldn't see your love, or worse, forgot to see it, I honor your story. In the comments, share, "I'm still here." If you've survived something silent, your voice can reach someone who is still listening in the dark, hoping to be understood. And if this story resonated with you, for the person you lost, the person who left, or the person you tried to reach, I invite you to subscribe, because this is more than a channel. It's a community of survival, of truth, of unsung fathers, unseen mothers, children who wait, and those who stay. Hit that subscribe button so we keep these stories alive together. Before you go, there's another video waiting for you just on the screen. A story that continues, a life that didn't end with goodbye. Click it. Let's keep walking through the silence together. Until we meet again in the next story.